My name is Isabella Crane. I'm 34 years old, an interior architect based in Seattle, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the quiet ornament in a family that only valued the ones who made noise. Every Christmas has been a mirror of that truth. My parents at the center, my brother basking in their light, and me, somewhere in the background, watching warmth that never reached me. If you're watching this, please like the video. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and subscribe. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the people who forget us teach us how to remember ourselves. It started 3 weeks before Christmas. I was wrapping up a client meeting when my phone buzzed with a new message. Crane Family Christmas 2025. For a moment, I felt that old, automatic flicker of hope. Maybe this year would be different. But when I opened the group chat, my screen filled with plans already made, menus, flight confirmations, and photos of table settings I hadn't designed. The words that hollowed me out came from my mother. Just immediate family this year, to keep it simple. I reread the line until the letters blurred. Immediate family. And yet, my brother's girlfriend, barely 6 months in the picture, was listed for dessert duty. My uncle's stepdaughter, whom they saw twice a year, had been asked to handle decorations. My name never appeared. No one even asked if I could come. I wasn't forgotten by accident. I was excluded on purpose. That night, I sat in my apartment, the city lights flickering across the glass walls, and let the silence stretch. It wasn't the kind of hurt that makes you cry. It was the kind that hardens. I thought about all the years of being the grateful one, the one who smiled through being overlooked. I remembered the Christmas when my gift was a scented candle someone else had already burned. I remembered how my father had once told me, "You make things look beautiful, Isabella. Just don't expect people to notice." I'd believed him for too long. But something shifted that night. The ache in my chest turned into clarity. A quiet, elegant fury. I didn't want another December waiting for an invitation that would never come. I wanted to create something that didn't need their permission. When I looked around my living room, the garland I'd hung myself, the soft glow of the tree, it struck me. I'd built beauty for everyone else all year long. Maybe it was time to build something for me. I opened my calendar, scrolled past the empty 25th, and started planning. I had a lodge in Lake Tahoe, my sanctuary, my proof that I'd made a life on my own terms. 6 bedrooms, a view that made the snow look like light. If my family wanted an intimate Christmas, fine. I'd host my own. But I wouldn't be alone. By the time I closed my laptop, the idea had already taken root. This wouldn't be a getaway. It would be a statement. And when they realized where everyone else had gone, it would already be too late. The days after that message felt like walking through a dream I no longer believed in. The city was alive with Christmas lights and soft carols spilling from shop doors, but to me, everything sounded distant, dulled by the echo of that one sentence. Just immediate family. It played in my head like static, looping until even silence seemed to hum with it. I threw myself into work, sketching living rooms for other people's holidays, fireplaces glowing, stockings perfectly placed, families smiling in the renderings. Each project felt like a performance I no longer wanted to direct. When I looked at those warm golden spaces, I thought, this is what I make for strangers, while my own family pretends I don't exist. One evening, I closed my laptop and stood by the window. The city below was a constellation of light and movement, people rushing home with gifts, laughter carried through the cold air. And then, like a thread being pulled, an image formed in my mind. My lodge in Lake Tahoe, quiet, unused, waiting. I had bought it 5 years ago, during a season when I thought solitude was strength. It sat high in the mountains, surrounded by pines that stayed green no matter how heavy the snow fell. 6 bedrooms, a grand stone fireplace, floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the sunrise. I had filled it with things I loved: handmade ceramics, soft wool throws, books stacked in uneven towers. It wasn't a showpiece like my parents' house. It was a home that breathed. That night, I made a list. Not a guest list, not yet. Just names of people who had once made me feel seen. My Aunt Lorraine, who used to sneak me slices of pie when my mother said I didn't need dessert. My cousin Noah, who'd helped me move into my first apartment when no one else offered. My father's sister Julia, who had quietly told me at my brother's wedding, "You deserved to be celebrated too." I wrote until the page filled with people who had always existed at the edges of family gatherings, the ones who smiled through being overlooked, just like me. The next morning, I started calling. My voice was calm, careful, but underneath it, there was a pulse, a secret thrill. I told them I was hosting a Christmas gathering at my lodge, all expenses covered, just a small, peaceful celebration in the snow. I didn't mention my parents. I didn't need to. Lorraine cried on the phone. She said she hadn't been to Tahoe in 20 years and didn't realize how much she'd missed the mountains. Noah didn't hesitate. He said he'd bring his wife and that it sounded like the best idea anyone in this family has had in a long time. Each yes came with a warmth that made my chest ache in a new way. Not pain, but recognition. By the end of the week, every room in the lodge was spoken for. Flights booked, dates confirmed. It was happening. As I planned, something inside me began to shift. For years, I'd chased inclusion, asking, waiting, hoping. But now, for the first time, I was choosing. Choosing who got to sit at my table. Choosing who deserved my presence. That power was addictive, but it was also healing. I wanted the weekend to feel like a storybook. I called a florist in Tahoe and ordered garlands thick with pine and berries, long enough to wrap around the staircase. I found a local bakery that made almond croissants like the ones I'd loved as a kid. I hired a chef to prepare a Christmas Eve dinner: roast duck, caramelized carrots, spiced mulled wine. I planned hot cocoa for the mornings, sleigh rides through the snow-covered trails, even a pianist for soft music in the evenings. This wasn't about extravagance, it was about intention. Every detail was a declaration. I was worth the effort. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. I'd be arranging mood boards for table settings and suddenly hear my mother's voice in my mind. "You always overdo things, Isabella." I'd catch myself wondering if this was childish, if I was proving her right by trying so hard to outshine her. But then I'd remember the empty space they had left me in, year after year, and I'd feel the weight of my own resolve return. By mid-December, I drove up to Tahoe to oversee the final touches. The highway was lined with fir trees dusted in snow, the sky a soft gray that promised more to come. When I reached the lodge, the stillness hit me like a blessing. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and new beginnings. I walked from room to room, checking lists, fluffing pillows, lighting candles just to see how the glow moved across the walls. The house felt different. Not lonely anymore, but alive with anticipation. I imagined the laughter that would fill it, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of people who finally belonged somewhere. For the first time in years, Christmas wasn't something happening to me. It was something I was creating. That night, I stood by the window, watching snow drift past the glass. My phone buzzed on the counter, my mother's name lighting the screen. I didn't answer. I let it ring, the sound swallowed by the quiet hum of the fire. Let them wonder. Because this year, the silence would be mine. And for once, it would speak louder than theirs ever could. The morning of December 23rd arrived like a held breath finally released. Snow was falling in soft, slow spirals outside the lodge, covering the drive in a thin veil of white. I woke before the sun, lit the fire, and walked through the rooms one last time. Everything was ready. The garlands, the candles, the linens pressed and folded, the tables waiting for names. It felt less like a home now, and more like a stage set for the version of Christmas I'd been denied all my life. The first text came a little after 9. "Landed. Tahoe looks unreal." Another followed moments later. "On the shuttle now. Can't wait to see you." By noon, the rhythm of arrivals began. Headlights glimmering through the snow, car doors closing, laughter breaking the silence that had filled the house for weeks. I opened the door to the first group: Aunt Lorraine, her husband, and their 2 grown daughters. Her eyes went wide at the sight of the great room, the 12-foot tree glittering in gold and white. She turned to me and whispered, "It's beautiful, Bella." One by one, the others arrived. Coats came off, boots thudded on the entry mat, and the air filled with that unmistakable hum of togetherness. I took their bags, led them through the hallways, and watched as awe softened into comfort. By evening, the lodge was alive, firelight dancing across glasses of wine, music humming softly from hidden speakers, the smell of baked brie and rosemary drifting through the air. I'd told myself this wasn't about revenge, but as I watched everyone settle in, I couldn't deny the quiet pulse of satisfaction running beneath my skin. I thought about my parents' dining room back in Seattle, the perfectly folded napkins, the harpist rehearsing by the fireplace, the table set for a family that would never be complete. I wondered when they'd notice how many seats were empty this year. When the first dinner began, I kept things simple: roasted chicken, truffle pasta, a chocolate tart dusted with sugar like snow. I made a toast, thanking everyone for coming, and though I didn't mention my parents, the silence afterward carried an unspoken truth. We all knew why we were here, not to defy anyone, but to remember what being wanted felt like. Later that night, after everyone drifted to bed, I stood by the window in the great room, the glass cold against my hand. My phone lay on the mantel, screen dark. I hadn't checked it in hours, but curiosity finally won. When I picked it up, the notifications lit the room. 3 missed calls from my mother, 2 from my brother, 1 from my father. No messages, just calls. Their preferred way of controlling the story, never leaving evidence of their tone. I set the phone face down and turned back to the fire. The snow outside was falling heavier now, the kind that turns the world soundless. For the first time, I felt that silence not as loneliness, but as luxury. I was surrounded by people who had chosen to be here. That was worth more than any apology that might never come. The next morning, laughter woke me. It echoed up the staircase, someone burning toast, someone else playing the piano badly but joyfully. I padded downstairs in my robe and found Noah making cocoa for the kids, his hair a mess, his smile easy. Lorraine was sitting by the fire knitting, her cheeks pink from the heat. It struck me then. This felt natural, effortless, as if this had always been the real family and I had simply forgotten to notice. Mid-morning brought the first message. My mother again, this time a text. "Where are you spending Christmas, Isabella?" A few hours later, another. "Is everyone with you?" Then my brother, blunt as ever. "Mom's freaking out. Just tell her what's going on." I didn't answer. Instead, I took my coat and stepped outside. The cold bit at my skin, but the air was clean, sharp, honest. From the porch, I could see the mountains stretched like frozen waves against the horizon. Somewhere beyond them, my parents were realizing what it felt like to be left out. That thought didn't fill me with triumph, only understanding. They had spent years teaching me how to live without their approval. I was simply showing them I had learned. By evening, the house was glowing again. The chef prepared a second dinner, richer than the first. Roast duck, buttered potatoes, champagne that never stopped flowing. We lingered for hours, talking about old times, sharing stories I'd never heard because I'd never been invited into those conversations before. At one point, I caught my reflection in the window, firelight flickering behind me, snow drifting outside, and I barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because she had changed overnight, but because she finally looked like she belonged somewhere. Before bed, I checked my phone one last time. 23 missed calls now. No voicemails, just silence waiting to be broken. I powered it off and left it on the nightstand. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. And somewhere, in a house that used to define me, my absence was the loudest sound of all. Christmas Eve arrived with a quiet kind of light, the kind that doesn't rush to fill the room, but glows softly, as if reminding you that warmth doesn't need to be loud. I woke before everyone else, walked barefoot through the great room, and stood by the window watching the snow drift past the glass. Outside, the pines were heavy with frost, the world still and untouched. Inside, the fire whispered low, a pulse of orange against the gray morning. It was the kind of peace I used to imagine existed only in movies, but now it was here, in a space I had built myself. By mid-morning, the lodge began to stir. Doors opened upstairs, footsteps creaked down the hall, the smell of cinnamon and coffee filled the air. My cousin Noah brought in wood for the fire, his wife started humming carols softly under her breath, and Aunt Lorraine laughed at something in the kitchen, a sound so warm it made my chest ache. There was a calm joy in the house, the kind that asked for nothing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't performing. We spent the late morning outside. The snow had softened overnight, blanketing the hills in smooth white curves. A few of us grabbed sleds from the garage, and soon the silence broke into shouts and laughter echoing off the mountains. I hadn't laughed like that in years. Not politely, not half-heartedly, but the kind of laughter that steals your breath. At one point, I fell backward into the snow, the sky spinning above me, and I thought, this is what belonging feels like. Not approval, not permission, just presence. When we came back inside, cheeks red and hands numb, the house smelled like rosemary and garlic. The chef was already preparing dinner, the Christmas Eve feast I'd imagined weeks ago when this was just an idea on paper. The table gleamed beneath candlelight, each plate perfectly set, each napkin tied with twine and a small sprig of pine. I'd chosen gold-rimmed glasses that caught the firelight in their curves. It looked beautiful, yes, but it also felt alive. A table that wanted to be gathered around. While I arranged the final touches, my phone buzzed again from the counter. I ignored it at first, but after the third buzz I looked. Another call from my mother, then one from my father, then a text from my brother. They're upset, Bella. Just answer them. I put the phone face down. The irony wasn't lost on me. Years of silence from them, and now they couldn't stand mine. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the house filled with light. Everyone dressed up for dinner, nothing formal, just cozy sweaters, soft fabrics, laughter that didn't need to be restrained. I made a short toast, thanking everyone for being here, for choosing this. I didn't mention my parents by name, but the air shifted anyway, a quiet understanding passing between us. We all knew who wasn't here, and why. During dinner, the snow outside thickened, falling in fat, slow flakes that glowed against the windows. Inside, the music played low, piano and strings, gentle and endless. My aunt told stories from her childhood, ones I'd never heard because I'd always been seated too far away at the family table to catch them. My uncle spoke about how he'd almost skipped this year's Christmas altogether, tired of the tension that always hovered at my parents' house. He said, "This feels like what it used to be, before everything became about appearances." After dessert, we moved to the great room. Someone opened another bottle of wine. The fire crackled. The pianist, a friend of Noah's, began to play something slow and familiar. People talked in low voices, leaning close, the room bathed in gold. I sat back on the sofa, my legs tucked beneath me, watching it all. I didn't feel the usual urge to prove, to perform, to apologize for taking up space. I was simply here, and it was enough. Later, when the others had drifted off to bed, I found myself alone again by the window. The phone still sat where I'd left it, screen dark but heavy with unanswered calls. I picked it up, not to answer, but to look at the list. 15 missed calls from my mother, 10 from my father, 3 from my brother. I could almost hear their voices in my head, the practiced concern, the wounded tones, the way they'd twist this into something cruel. For years, they'd made me believe silence meant isolation. But standing there, the firelight flickering against the glass, I understood something new. Silence could also mean peace, control, freedom. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft as breath, blanketing everything it touched. The mountains stood like sentinels, silent and unmoving. Somewhere beyond them, my parents were sitting at their polished table, the harpist playing to an empty room, the sound echoing off walls that had never known warmth. And here, in this lodge full of light and laughter, I felt the balance of things shift. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day. And for once, I wasn't dreading it. I was waiting for it, calm, ready, and entirely uninvited. Christmas morning came softly, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath. The sky was pale gold above the mountains, and the snow outside glowed like crushed glass under the early sun. Inside the lodge, the lights on the tree still twinkled faintly from the night before, their reflection rippling across the windows. The air smelled of coffee and sugar, and faint music drifted from the kitchen. For the first time in years, I didn't wake to tension, or to the feeling that I was intruding on someone else's story. I woke to peace, a fragile, beautiful peace that felt earned. I wrapped myself in a robe and padded down the stairs. The great room was already alive with quiet laughter and the rustle of wrapping paper. My cousins sat cross-legged on the floor, trading gifts, while my aunt placed cinnamon rolls on a platter big enough to feed a small army. I stood for a moment just watching, letting the sound of it all fill me. The warmth of the fire, the smell of pine, the rhythm of soft voices. It was everything Christmas was supposed to be, and everything I had never really had. We ate breakfast together at the long table, coffee steaming, jam jars open, plates scattered with crumbs. Lorraine made a toast, saying she couldn't remember the last time Christmas had felt this genuine. People nodded, smiled, wiped at their eyes. I smiled too, but a part of me stayed distant, listening for the sound of my phone vibrating upstairs. I knew it would come. I'd turned it on late last night just once and seen the flood of missed calls that had built up like snow on a roof. By late morning, when the house quieted and the kids had gone outside to play, I slipped away to the small office at the top of the stairs. The phone was waiting on the desk, dark and silent, as if it knew what was coming. I hesitated for a long time before unlocking it. There were new messages, a dozen at least. My father's were brief and clipped, each one sharper than the last. This has gone far enough. Call your mother. You've made your point. My brother's tone was impatient, almost pleading. They're upset, Bella. Just talk to them before it gets worse. And then there were the ones from my mother. Long paragraphs, the words tumbling into each other without punctuation, heavy with accusation. You manipulated them. You turned everyone against us. You embarrassed this family. I read them all slowly, one after another, feeling the weight of each line settle in my chest. Then I scrolled to the top and called her. She answered before the first ring had even finished. Her voice came sharp, brittle, the kind that cuts even when it pretends to care. She didn't ask where I was or if I was happy. She went straight to the wound. Why would you do this to us? I didn't interrupt. I let her pour it all out. The disbelief, the anger, the self-pity dressed as confusion. When she finally paused, breathless, I said quietly, I didn't do anything to you. I invited people to spend Christmas with me. They chose to come. That silence that followed was louder than her shouting had been. She tried to recover, said she hadn't meant to exclude me, that the immediate family thing was misunderstood. She told me not to make this a competition. I could hear my father in the background, his voice low, asking if she'd told me that families don't keep score. I almost laughed, because that's all they'd ever done, kept score of love, affection, attention. And I had always been the losing number. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend or justify. I just told her the truth. That being left out wasn't new, but what was new was that I no longer needed an invitation. I told her I hoped they enjoyed their day, then ended the call before she could reply. When I walked back downstairs, the lodge was golden with afternoon light. My cousins were decorating snowmen outside, and someone had turned on soft jazz that melted into the sound of laughter drifting through the open door. No one asked about the call, and I didn't offer. The world had shifted in that small, private conversation upstairs, but I wanted this space to stay untouched by it. Later, as the sun slipped behind the mountains, we gathered again for dinner. The table glittered beneath the candles, and for the first time in my life, I felt like Christmas didn't belong to anyone but us. The forgotten ones who had found each other. We ate slowly, spoke gently, and when someone made a toast, it wasn't to wealth or legacy, but to peace. After dinner, I stepped outside with a glass of wine. The air was cold enough to sting, the stars sharp against the dark. Somewhere out there, my parents were sitting in their house, surrounded by silence they couldn't explain. I knew they'd twist the story, make me the villain. But it didn't matter. Because this time, I wasn't chasing their version of love. I had built my own. And the light from my lodge, steady, warm, and full, was proof that I had finally come home. The day after Christmas always feels like the world has exhaled. Slower, quieter, as if even the air has grown tired from celebration. But that morning in Lake Tahoe, the stillness carried a different kind of weight. The laughter that had filled every corner of the lodge had softened into murmurs. People moved slower, speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace we'd built. I woke to the sound of snow sliding off the roof and the faint clatter of dishes downstairs. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I just lay there, wrapped in the warmth of the blankets, listening. The silence wasn't lonely. It was earned, the kind that follows a storm you've survived. When I finally got up, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My hair was a mess, my eyes tired, but I looked lighter, like something had been quietly lifted off my chest overnight. Downstairs, the great room looked lived in. Mugs half full of cocoa, blankets draped across chairs, ribbons and bits of wrapping paper scattered beneath the tree. The chaos was beautiful. It wasn't the sterile perfection my parents chased every year. This was real, human, imperfect in the best way. Lorraine was at the stove, humming softly while stirring oatmeal. "Sleep well?" she asked when she saw me. I nodded, pouring myself coffee, grateful she didn't ask about the phone call. The people in this house knew the story without needing it told. They had lived their own versions of it. The quiet exclusions, the polite dismissals, the invisible boundaries drawn by people who measured love in appearances. After breakfast, guests began to trickle out in pairs. The first shuttle came at noon, its tires crunching over the snow. There were long hugs by the door, promises to call soon, to visit before next Christmas. Each goodbye left the house a little quieter, the air a little stiller. By the time the last car pulled away, the lodge felt enormous. A cathedral of silence, echoing with the memory of laughter. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching the banisters, straightening pillows, collecting forgotten scarves. Every corner carried the echo of something good, warmth, belonging, connection. It was everything I'd ever wanted from my family, and for once, I hadn't needed their permission to have it. When I reached the kitchen, my phone was sitting on the counter, black screen reflecting the ceiling lights. I'd turned it off the night before, but now, curiosity tugged at me. I hesitated before pressing the button. Dozens of notifications blinked to life. Missed calls, new messages, voicemails. My father had written first, "We need to talk. This isn't how family behaves." My mother's texts followed, spilling across the screen. "You humiliated us. Everyone is talking. You've divided the family for no reason." Each one felt like a thread trying to pull me back into the web I'd finally escaped. But one message caught my eye. It was from my brother. Just 3 words. "I get it now." I read it twice. Then again. There was no elaboration, no apology, but somehow it was enough. A small, unexpected crack in the wall that had always separated us. I put the phone down and stepped back. For once, I didn't need to reply. That afternoon, the world outside the windows turned silver. Clouds gathered over the mountains, and a fine snow began to fall, quiet and endless. I made tea and sat by the window, watching it drift. Without the noise of voices, the house seemed to breathe again. Creaks in the wood, the occasional whisper of wind against the glass. It would have been easy to feel lonely then. A year ago, I might have. But instead, I felt something steadier. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter, deeper. Peace, born of clarity. I thought about the conversation with my mother, about the way her voice cracked between anger and disbelief. For so long, she'd lived in a world where control meant love, where silence meant victory. She couldn't understand that my silence now wasn't a weapon, it was self-respect. When the snow grew heavier, I went outside, The cold stung my face, the air sharp and clean. My footprints were the only marks on the untouched white. I stood at the edge of the porch, watching the world blur in gray and white, and thought of all the Christmases before this one. The ones where I'd sat at their table pretending it didn't hurt. The ones where I'd smiled through being forgotten. I realized then that this wasn't revenge anymore. It had started that way. A carefully orchestrated act meant to make them feel what I had felt. But somewhere between the laughter, the firelight, and the quiet goodbyes, it had changed. This wasn't about making them hurt. It was about proving that I could exist fully outside their shadow. When I went back inside, the fire had burned low, just embers glowing like eyes in the dark. I sat down on the rug and watched them pulse. The house felt different now, not empty, but resting. I understood that soon I'd have to go back to Seattle, back to work, back to the familiar rhythm of everyday life. But I also knew something fundamental had shifted. I would never again wait for an invitation that came with conditions. Never again measure my worth against their silence. Before going to bed, I sent one last message, not to my parents, but to everyone who had been here. Thank you for coming. For making this Christmas what it should have always been. Then I turned off the lights, leaving only the tree glowing faintly in the corner. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing footprints, softening edges, covering the world in a clean, quiet truth. For the first time, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt free. The morning after the guests left felt unreal, the kind of quiet that hums with echoes. Every sound carried farther now, the groan of the floorboards, the soft creak of the chimney, the distant rustle of branches against the window. The house, so full of life just a day ago, had returned to stillness. But it wasn't the heavy kind of silence I'd known growing up, the one filled with unspoken words and judgment disguised as calm. This was something purer, the kind of silence that follows truth. I woke late, the pale winter light slipping through the curtains. For the first time in weeks, I didn't have a list to check or a timeline to chase. The event, my act of defiance, my quiet rebellion, had already happened. It was complete. Yet there was a lingering awareness, a tug in the air like static before a storm. I knew my parents wouldn't let it end here. Downstairs, the remnants of the holidays waited like artifacts of another life. The garlands had started to droop, the candles were burned low, and the tree lights blinked faintly, a heartbeat fading into the day. I made coffee, poured it into a mug, and stood by the window watching the snow drift down. The world outside was bright and clean, untouched. Inside, my phone sat on the counter, screen face down. A small black stone I didn't want to disturb. Eventually, I gave in. When I turned it over, the notifications bloomed like frost across glass. More messages than I could count. I scrolled through them slowly, feeling the familiar mixture of dread and detachment. My mother's tone had shifted overnight. No longer sharp, but wounded. You've embarrassed the family, Isabella. Do you realize what people are saying? Then, we never meant to hurt you. Why would you do this to us? My father's texts were shorter, colder. This is childish. Family isn't something you replace. And then there was one from my brother sent at dawn. They're angry, but they're scared too. I think you broke something in them. I set the phone down and stared at the fire. The logs cracked softly, sparks lifting and fading into ash. I thought about the word broke. He was right. Something had broken, but maybe it needed to. Maybe all those years of pretending we were whole had been the real fracture. By midday, the sun had melted the thin layer of snow on the porch. I decided to walk. The air outside was sharp and honest, the cold biting at my skin as I followed the trail leading down toward the lake. The ice was forming there, thin sheets that shimmered like glass under the light. I watched the wind ripple across it, carrying small bursts of snow, and for a while, I forgot everything. It was almost peaceful, until my phone rang again. I didn't have to look to know who it was. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then, finally, I answered. My mother's voice came through the line, trembling between anger and heartbreak. "I don't understand what you think you've done," she said. "Do you feel proud? Humiliating us like this? Making everyone think we're monsters?" Her words were sharp, but beneath them I could hear something else. Fear. The loss of control. "I didn't humiliate you," I said, my voice steady. "I invited people to Christmas. That's all, you stole them from us." "No," I said. "You gave them away when you decided I wasn't part of the family anymore." The silence that followed was long enough for me to hear the wind moving through the trees. Then my father's voice cut in, distant but unmistakable, firm, deliberate. "Enough, Isabella. You've made your point. Now stop before you do more damage." I almost laughed. The irony of it. Years of exclusion. And now I was the one accused of causing damage. "The only thing I've done," I said quietly, "is stop waiting for an invitation to exist." My father sighed, the kind of heavy, theatrical sigh that meant the conversation was over on his terms. "You're being dramatic." "You've always been dramatic." "Maybe," I said. "But at least this time, I'm being heard." And then I hung up. The sound of the call ending was clean, final, like a door closing on a drafty room that had never felt like home. When I got back to the lodge, the sky had begun to darken. The air smelled of pine and smoke. I built a fire, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat on the floor with my back against the sofa. The crackle of the wood filled the silence between thoughts. They would never understand what I had done. To them, it would always be an act of rebellion, not reclamation. But that didn't matter anymore. I hadn't done this for them to see. I'd done it so I could see myself, clearly, fully, without apology. I thought of my brother's message again. "You broke something in them." Maybe I had, but what he didn't realize was that something inside me had broken too, and in its place, something stronger had grown. Later that night, I stepped outside with a cup of tea. The sky was deep blue, almost black, the stars scattered like salt across velvet. The snow glittered faintly under the light spilling from the windows. I looked up at that endless sky and felt something quiet settle inside me. Not triumph, not bitterness, just peace. The phone buzzed again in my pocket. I took it out, looked at the screen, my mother's name glowing softly, and then turned it off completely. Inside, the lodge was warm, the fire burning low, the faint hum of life still lingering in the walls. I sat by the window, watching the snow begin again, and let the silence stretch. They could call 100 times. They could rewrite the story however they wanted. But this year, I had written mine. And I finally understood that I didn't need them to read it. The morning after that final call, the world outside was wrapped in stillness again. The kind of silence that feels deliberate, heavy, waiting. The storm had passed overnight, leaving the sky a pale, forgiving blue. The snow on the roof glistened like crushed diamonds, sliding off in slow, glimmering sheets. Inside the lodge, the fire had gone cold, and the air smelled faintly of pine and smoke. I moved quietly through the rooms, half expecting to find traces of the life that had filled them days ago, voices, laughter, footsteps. But there was only the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my bare feet. I made coffee and stood by the window. The view outside was endless white and quiet strength. The trees standing tall beneath their burden, the mountains steady in the distance. For years, I had thought stillness meant emptiness. Now I understood it could mean peace. I turned on my phone for the first time since hanging up the day before. There were new messages, of course. My mother again, her words weaving between guilt and resentment. "You've made your point. Are you happy now?" Then another, softer. "We just wanted a quiet Christmas." My father's text came next, just one line. "You've hurt your mother deeply." And then, a final one from my brother. "They're not going to admit it, but they know they pushed you too far." I stared at the screen for a long moment, the coffee cooling in my hands. A few months ago, a message like that would have sent me spiraling, guilt, confusion, the need to fix what I hadn't broken. But now it only settled into me like an echo fading into the distance. There was nothing left to repair, because the foundation had never been real. The house felt different that day. Not lonely, but sacred. Each room carried a memory from the last few days, fragments of warmth I could almost touch. The dining table still held faint wine stains, the smell of pine lingered in the air, and the piano in the corner still wore a few stray notes of laughter. I'd built this, not out of revenge, but out of longing. And somehow, that longing had turned into proof that I didn't need them to feel whole. By afternoon, the sun had melted small patches of snow off the porch railing. I stepped outside, pulling my coat tighter against the cold. The air bit at my skin, but felt cleaner, sharper. Down below, the lake was a sheet of silver, frozen smooth under the light. I walked the narrow path that wound behind the lodge, my boots crunching through the snow, the only sound in miles. Halfway down the hill, I stopped. The silence felt enormous, but not empty. It was the silence of something ending, and something else beginning. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone, the way she'd tried to frame my actions as cruelty instead of consequence. For so long, she'd been the one defining the story, who was right, who was wrong, who belonged. But this time, she didn't get to narrate it. I did. As I stood there, a memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. Christmas 10 years ago. I had been late because of work, rushing through the snow to make it in time for dinner. When I finally arrived, breathless and freezing, they were already at the table. My mother had looked up, smiled too brightly, and said, "Oh, Isabella, we didn't think you were coming. There's no seat left, but I'm sure we can squeeze you in." They hadn't meant it cruelly. Not in the way people think cruelty works. It was casual, habitual. That was the worst part. Being forgotten wasn't an accident in my family. It was tradition. That night replayed in my mind now like an old film reel. The empty seat, the polite laughter, the small ache of pretending it didn't matter. I realized that the version of me who had stood there smiling through it had finally died in this house. She'd been replaced by someone who didn't need to be squeezed in. Someone who had built her own table, her own walls, her own warmth. When I went back inside, I lit the fire again. The flames took slowly, curling around the wood, breathing life back into the room. I sat on the floor in front of it with my tea and let the heat reach me. My phone buzzed once on the counter, another call from my mother, but I didn't move. I wasn't avoiding her. I was choosing not to be pulled into the orbit she lived in, where guilt was gravity. Instead, I opened the journal I'd brought from Seattle, a habit I'd abandoned years ago. The first page was dated from when I was 20. "This year I'll try harder to fit in." I read the words slowly, feeling both pity and gratitude for the girl who had written them. She had done her best. She had carried the weight of being unseen without breaking. But now she didn't need to try harder. I wrote a new line beneath it. "This year I built something that didn't need their permission." Outside, the snow began again. Soft, endless, erasing footprints, smoothing edges. The mountains vanished into the mist, and the world turned white once more. I watched it for a long time, feeling that quiet freedom bloom in my chest. Later that night, I poured a glass of wine and turned on the string lights above the mantel. The glow filled the room like a heartbeat. I didn't turn on music. I didn't need it. The only soundtrack was the crackle of the fire and the soft tap of snow against the glass. I knew the phone would keep ringing for days. I knew they'd craft their own version of the story. One where I was ungrateful, dramatic, maybe even cruel. But it didn't matter. The truth didn't need defending. It lived here now, in the quiet warmth of the space I had created. I sat there until the fire burned low, the embers pulsing like stars. And in that silence, I realized something simple but undeniable. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like someone waiting to be remembered. I had remembered myself. The next morning, I woke to a silence that felt heavier, not empty, but full of endings. The sky outside was a muted gray, soft snow drifting down in lazy swirls that made the world look suspended, untouched. The fire had gone out overnight, leaving only pale ash in the hearth. For a long while, I didn't move. I just lay there under the weight of the blankets, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of wind against the glass. It hit me then. It was the day after everything. The day after the calls, the words, the realization that nothing would ever go back to the way it was. The storm had passed, but what remained was clarity. Sharp, clean, and cold. I got up slowly, the floor chilled against my feet, and made my way to the kitchen. The lodge felt cavernous now, too large for one person, its warmth lingering like perfume after a guest has left. The mugs were still on the counter from the day before, faint circles of cocoa marking the wood. The garlands had begun to dry, their pine needles crisp to the touch. I brewed a pot of coffee and watched the steam curl into the air. It was strange, how easily life returns to quiet after noise. When I turned on my phone, I half expected another wave of messages, but there was only one, from my brother. They're not talking to each other. Mom's blaming Dad, Dad's blaming her. I don't know what to say anymore. I think you finally got through to them, in a way no one ever could. I read it twice. There was no anger in his words, no sarcasm, just exhaustion. And beneath that, something that felt almost like respect. For the first time, I didn't feel like the family's problem to be fixed. I felt like the mirror they'd been avoiding. I replied with something simple. It wasn't about breaking them. It was about freeing myself. Then I put the phone away. The day stretched slow. Outside, the snow thickened, swallowing sound until even my footsteps felt muted. I wandered through the lodge, straightening the ornaments, folding blankets, tucking away the small traces of the holiday that had lived here. Each act felt like closure, a ritual of goodbye. In the great room, I stopped by the tree. Its lights still glowed faintly, though half the bulbs had dimmed. I'd always loved Christmas trees, their promise of togetherness, of warmth, of belonging. But for years, mine had felt like decoration without meaning. Now, even as it stood in silence, it felt like truth, beauty that didn't depend on anyone seeing it. I made another cup of coffee and sat by the window. The mountains were blurred by falling snow, a soft white veil drawn over the world. Somewhere beyond them, my parents were probably nursing their own version of events, a story where I was cruel, impulsive, ungrateful. I didn't need to hear it to know it existed. They'd tell their friends, their neighbors, maybe even themselves that I'd lost perspective. They'd say I'd made a scene. That's what people do when the illusion of control slips. They rewrite the story to make themselves the victims. But the truth was quieter than any of their noise. The truth lived here, in this house, in the air that no longer carried tension. By midday, I decided to go for a walk. The air outside was crisp, every breath a sting of cold that woke something deep in me. The forest was silent, except for the soft groan of branches under the weight of snow. I followed the path behind the lodge, the one that curved along the ridge before dipping toward the frozen lake. Every few steps, I'd stop to watch the world. The faint shimmer of ice, the ghostly outlines of trees, the delicate balance of silence and light. It struck me then how much I'd missed this, being in the moment without performing for anyone. Growing up, even stillness had felt like an audience. My parents had a way of turning everything into a test. How you sat, how you smiled, how you reacted to gifts you didn't want. Even joy had to be rehearsed. Out here, there was none of that. Just breath, snow, and space wide enough to hold every version of me I'd been forced to hide. I reached the edge of the lake and stood there, looking out over the glassy expanse. The surface was dusted with snow, untouched except for a single fallen branch frozen in place. I crouched down, tracing a line in the snow with my glove, and whispered the words I hadn't realized I'd been holding on to. I forgive you. It wasn't for them. Not really. It was for me. Because forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't absolution. It was release. On the walk back, I felt lighter. The path looked different somehow, though nothing had changed. Maybe that's what peace is. Not the absence of memory, but the absence of weight. When I returned to the lodge, the light had softened into gold. The fire I'd left cold that morning now called to be lit again. I built it slowly, arranging the logs like I was rebuilding something sacred. When the flames caught, they filled the room with warmth that reached farther than I expected. I sat by the fire, watching it dance, and thought about the girl I had been. The one who had waited every year for an invitation that never came. I wanted to tell her she'd done enough, that it was okay to stop trying. That she would one day host her own Christmas, not as revenge, but as proof that she could belong to herself. My phone buzzed once, another message from my brother. Just a photo this time, my parents' house. The table still set, half empty, untouched. No people in the frame, just the chairs, the candles, the cold perfection of a meal that no one wanted anymore. Beneath it, a short caption. They couldn't finish dinner. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Some silences don't demand an answer. They are the answer. I watched the fire burn low, the shadows flickering across the walls, the sound of wind whispering through the chimney. The house didn't feel too big anymore. It felt exactly the size of what I'd built. Not the family I was born into, but the one I chose. Peace, truth, and the quiet courage to start again. Before bed, I walked through the rooms one last time, turning off lights, touching door frames as if to thank them for what they'd held. At the tree, I paused. The lights shimmered softly against the window, their glow reflected in the snow outside. Tomorrow, I'd leave Tahoe and return to Seattle, back to my life, my work, my world. But I would carry this with me, the proof that I could create joy, even out of rejection. For years, I'd been waiting to be seen. This Christmas, I'd finally realized something simpler and stronger. I didn't need to be seen to exist. I just needed to stand in my own light. The morning I left Lake Tahoe began in blue-gray quiet. The snow had stopped during the night, and the world outside the window looked polished. Every branch coated in light, every drift smooth as glass. I sat up slowly, letting the silence settle around me. The lodge felt different now. Not lonely, not even empty. Just still, like it was waiting for its next story to begin. Downstairs, the fire had burned itself to ash, leaving a faint scent of smoke that clung to the wood beams. I moved through the rooms barefoot, touching the furniture, the walls, the edges of the staircase. Every corner carried a memory from the last week, the echo of laughter, the hum of music, the warmth that had lived here for a brief, perfect stretch of time. The evidence of belonging. I made coffee and stood at the window. Outside, the sun was rising behind the mountains, turning the snow into a mirror of light. For a long time, I just watched. It felt like the universe had drawn a curtain closed and then quietly reopened it to reveal a new scene. One where I wasn't the background character anymore. My phone sat on the counter, face down. I hadn't checked it since last night. I already knew what would be waiting. More messages, maybe another call from my mother, another attempt at rewriting the narrative. But I didn't feel the pull to read them. The story had already ended. Their words couldn't change the ending. I poured the coffee, packed my bag, and walked one last slow loop around the lodge. In the great room, the tree still stood glowing faintly, its reflection shimmering in the windows. The ornaments caught the early light, each one chosen, placed, remembered. I reached out and touched one, a small glass heart, the same kind my mother used to hang on her tree every year, the one she never let me touch because they were too fragile. This one hadn't broken. I smiled at that. By mid-morning, I'd cleaned the kitchen, folded the blankets, and stacked the logs neatly by the fireplace for next time. I left a single candle burning on the mantel. Not a goodbye, just a marker of presence, proof that I had existed here, that something meaningful had happened within these walls. Outside, the car was buried under a thin layer of snow. I brushed it clean, started the engine, and waited for the heat to rise. The tires crunched over the frozen ground as I began the slow drive down the mountain road. The world around me looked endless. Pines dusted in silver, the lake glinting through the trees, the sky stretching wide and bright. It was hard to believe that this was the same world that had once felt small enough to trap me. Halfway down the road, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. I almost ignored it, but something in me hesitated. I picked it up and saw a message from my brother. "They're quiet now. I think they're realizing it's not about you being ungrateful. It's about them not seeing you. I'm sorry." I pulled the car over to the side of the road and read it again. For years, I'd wished for those words, from anyone, in any form. I'd built entire fantasies around the idea that one day, someone in my family would see it the way it really was. And now that the moment had arrived, it didn't feel explosive or triumphant. It just felt calm. Like something that had been crooked for too long had finally straightened itself out. I typed back, "Thank you." Then, after a pause, "Take care of yourself, Michael." And that was all. The rest of the drive was quiet. I kept the radio off, letting the sound of the tires and the wind fill the space. I thought about what waited back in Seattle, my apartment overlooking the city, my half-finished projects, my life that had been on pause while I built this one perfect week. I wondered how it would feel to return to all of it, carrying this new kind of peace. When I reached the highway, the mountains faded behind me, and with them, the weight of everything I'd been carrying for years. I didn't feel like the girl who'd been excluded anymore. I felt like the woman who'd learned to include herself. It was late afternoon when I got home. The city looked almost festive still, traces of holiday lights blinking against the gray sky. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it, tidy, functional, a little too quiet. But now the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt like invitation. I unpacked slowly, placing my coat on the rack, my keys on the counter, my notebook beside the lamp. I made tea and sat by the window as dusk crept in, watching the people on the street below hurry through the cold. Somewhere out there, families were gathering, laughing, returning to routines that made sense to them. And for the first time, I didn't envy them. I opened my notebook again, the same one I'd written in by the fire 2 days before, and turned to a fresh page. The ink bled smoothly as I wrote. This year, I stopped waiting to be chosen. I built something that could hold me instead. The words looked simple, but they carried weight. They carried freedom. When night fell, I lit a single candle and placed it on the windowsill. The flame flickered against the glass, reflected over and over again in the city lights. I thought of all the years I had spent chasing approval, shrinking myself to fit into rooms that were too small for me. I thought of every time I'd smiled through hurt just to keep the peace. And I thought of this Christmas, the one that began with exclusion and ended with belonging. My phone buzzed once more, but I didn't reach for it. I knew what it would be. My mother again, perhaps, or my father, or maybe silence from them both. Whatever it was, it no longer had power here. Instead, I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of wine, and stood by the window. Outside, the snow had started again, soft and slow, each flake catching the glow of the streetlights as it fell. I watched it for a long time, feeling something inside me finally loosen completely. I wasn't angry anymore. The resentment that had once burned so brightly had turned into something gentler. Understanding, maybe. I didn't need to forgive them aloud. Forgiveness wasn't about words. It was about letting go of the part of yourself that keeps waiting for someone else to heal the wound they made. As the night deepened, I thought about the years ahead. The next Christmas, the next version of myself I hadn't met yet. Maybe one day my parents would call and we'd talk. Maybe we wouldn't. Either way, I would be fine. Because what I'd built in that mountain lodge wasn't a one-time act of rebellion. It was a blueprint, a way of living where I never had to ask for permission to belong again. Before going to bed, I blew out the candle. The last curl of smoke rose into the air, twisting like a sigh before fading. The darkness that followed wasn't empty. It was restful. Lying in bed, I let the quiet fold around me, warm and steady. The city hummed softly outside, alive but distant. My eyes drifted closed, and somewhere between waking and sleep, I thought of the snow falling over Lake Tahoe, the lodge standing in silence, the fire cold, but the memory still glowing. I didn't need to hold on to the pain anymore. It had already served its purpose, and for the first time in my life, I felt it completely, not the ache of being forgotten, but the calm, solid joy of finally being free.